I've got a lovely little boy.
Oh, Christ.
I must be very proud of him.
Get those eyes. What the hell's the matter with him? Sometimes I wonder why we bother interviewing prize bastards like this.
Hello, thank you again for joining me here at Bert's Books, where this time we are going to be comparing and contrasting two, on the face of it, very different books, which nonetheless tap into a common theme. First of all, Ray Connolly's Stardust, the novelisation of the screenplay of the film of 1974, starring David Essex, and comparing that with Fred and Judy Vermorel's Starlust, a 1985 examination into the secret life of pop fans. Welcome to Lust in the Dust. Now, you may be wondering why I've chosen to do these two books in conjunction rather than That'll Be the Day, the first of the two-parter that finishes with Stardust. The short answer being I've lost my copy of That'll Be the Day. In any case, you don't strictly need it to enjoy this. It does give you some useful background information, but you can kind of take either on its own. Although the first book is useful in providing a bit of background about the character of Jim McClane. First story following him from childhood. He's born around the war years, and which takes him to the cusp of his musical life, the transformational decade of the 1960s. It gives us a picture of Jim's character as well as the family circumstances which might have shaped it. Jim is a free-spirited, impulsive, creative sort of character, but he's also an erratic, self-serving type of chap with a long track record of disappointing the people closest to him. Classic pop star material, you might argue. Connolly, who wrote both the screenplays and the novels for these titles, was highly qualified to tackle the subject matter. He'd worked as a journalist for the Evening Standard throughout the 60s, interviewing many of the period's musical figureheads, and was therefore excellently positioned when this turned out to be the subject area of his debut screenplay. In collaboration with producer David Putman, Connolly set out to make his story gritty and authentic in its replication of his own experiences of adolescence within the post-war period. Stardust picks up shortly after That'll Be the Day signs off, allowing enough time for Jim McClane to have mastered the rudiments of the bass guitar and to establish himself with the hard-working rhythm and blues outfit, the Stray Cats, who predate those Stray Cats, evidently. The Stray Cats are active on the circuit, but they're unable to break through into the bigger league without the sort of managerial sus that Jim suspects might lie with Mike Minari, his old buddy from his fairground days, a role being taken over from Ringo Starr by Adam Faith in this film. Mike is back on the dodgems after having been hospitalised in an attack from which Jim had copped out from helping him out with. Mike has few illusions about the kind of self-serving bastard that Jim McClane is. But while the latter's appearance on the same night as the Kennedy assassination seems like a rather unwelcome intrusion from Mike's past, he allows himself to be talked around into checking out Jim's band, and almost in spite of himself he has to concede that the situation does seem to have some potential. Mike agrees to take on the position of road manager. There's a number of rough edges he's going to have to work on, however. One being the outsized ego of the then frontman Johnny Cameron. Mike's talents as a natural-born hustler reap dividends fairly quickly, securing the band a cheap van, residency gig booking with accommodation thrown in, and the financial backing of a local businessman named Ronald Harrap, quickly nicknamed somewhat disrespectfully Laundrette Lil. So Mike is effectively propelling his charges on the heels of the Beatles and the Stones, while in the background he begins to fan the flames of Jim's ambition, in that perhaps Jim, more than the overcocky Johnny, is the frontman material. The Stray Cats are placed on a bill with those birds with the tits and arses from Birmingham, the Femmettes, whose twin backing singers are known as the Thunder Thighs. Eyeing them from side stage, Jim suggests to Mike, one each. Mike fixes up a post-gig rendezvous, an arrangement which Jim then stiffs him on by barricading himself into the bedroom with both. Mike sort of expected this sort of thing from Jim and contents himself with a night in listening to the Clay Liston fight on the radio, while in another room the Thunder Thighs humiliate Jim on his lack of sexual stamina and get to work on each other. They're supposed to be twins. Mike takes Cassius Clay's underdog victory as a good omen for Jim and the Stray Cats' career. In the meantime, Launderette Lil has pulled in a favour from an old family connection, the up-and-coming music publisher Colin Day, who agrees to give Harap's charges a listen and agrees to fix them a single deal for which they're installed in a recording studio to get down a Johnny-led number for the A-side and one of Jim and Stevie's originals for the flip. By this point, Harap's usefulness to all parties is starting to look a bit shaky, and he's pulled aside by Mike for one of those fateful fancy a drink type of conversations. Coincidentally, I think this is how Joe Strummer used to sack people. Session over, they hightail it to the Bag of Nails Club to celebrate, and Johnny, already suffering from a premature star complex, acquits himself rather badly with the girls in the place before they're ousted from their table in favour of a better established group. This humiliation is compounded for Johnny by the revelation that his song is now being relegated to the B-side in favour of Jim's. His slippery standing within the group being further eroded through some sly manoeuvring on Mike's part at the record's launch party, where Mike then engages into some pimp-like activity in order to get an influential pirate DJ into his pocket. The record turns out to be a bit of a grower and levers the Stray Cats, who are now managed by Colin Day, with Jim pushed forward as their frontman into the lower tiers of stardom. Teen hysteria soon follows. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones may have been kings of the world in 1964, but it must have done them good now and again to look over their shoulders and to see the Stray Cats making a nice little living following in their wake. The all-important American break soon comes, and this is the cue for Mike to have the fancy a drink conversation with Johnny. With Jim now manoeuvred into the pole position, an exhaustive promotional schedule now gets underway. Somewhere amid all this, Danielle becomes a fixture in Jim's life. She's clearly no groupie. She's far more cultured than the usual camp followers, and she leads Jim unexpectedly into a world of ballet, opera and art. Naturally, Mike can't stand her. Finally, the US tour is upon them, and on their arrival in New York, it's clear that the rest of the group, who incidentally include Dave Edmunds and Keith Moon among their number, are beginning to resent the attention that Jim is receiving. As the others watch him from their hotel suite, airing his ill-thought-out worldviews in a TV interview, drummer JD, Keith, pronounces, "What a prick." Not long into the tour, it transpires that Colin Day has, without warning, sold out the majority of his shares in the enterprise to the American entrepreneur Porter Lee Austin, played by a then relatively unknown Larry Hagman, who supposedly based his performance as J.R. Ewing as his character here. Still, things press ahead, and they're now filling the vacuum vacated by the Beatles, who have tired of touring and whose sound is now becoming contrived and gimmicky. While driving rock and roll, free from the tinge of LSD, is still the Stray Cats stock in trade. By the spring of 1966, they have 4 singles in the top 40. Jim's fan base is swelling, and so is his bank balance. However, tour fatigue is beginning to set in, along with personal resentments from within the band's ranks, particularly at the star treatment that Jim is receiving. The promotional drive has made Jim all things to all men. As cute as a monkey, as mean as a Jagger, as intelligent as a Dylan, as plastic as a Beatle. Bloody Beatles, eh? God forbid that one of them would act in one of your screenplays. Actually, a glance at Connolly's bibliography indicates that he doesn't have a place in hell for the Beatles. He's written extensively on them. That summer they get a brief opportunity to catch their breaths, Jim and Danielle joining Porter Lee at his Bermuda retreat for a bit of sunshine. However, relaxation barely comes into it as New York are on the phone, pressing for a pre-Christmas release date for the next Stray Cats release. The pressure on Jim to write to order comes to a head at a dinner party one evening. He's an artist, not a bloody jukebox. Anyway, he's talked around, and just as he and Danielle are enjoying a bit of personal time between themselves, Mike sticks his oar in to inform Jim, rather clumsily, that his mum has just died. Being the selfish arse that he is, Jim hasn't given his mum the time of day for years, but he and Danielle head back for the service, at which Jim becomes curiously fixated with the mass that's being performed and insists on jotting notes down during the service. Before exiting the church, to a hysterical crush of teenage fans and a confrontation with a recriminatory Jeanette and little Jimmy, whose existence you'll be familiar with from That'll Be the Day. Danielle, of course, isn't, and neither is Jim's public. Mike has secretly hoped that all this palaver will have put Danielle off, but if anything, it's made her feelings for Jim even stronger. They're off back to the States for an autumn tour, and the hits keep flowing, while relations within the band go from bad to worse. This comes to a head in New York, where Jim, Mike and Danielle are invited to Max's by the boys for some drinks, where JD, Alex, Stevie and Kevin announce that they're splitting from Jim to go their own way. They've already set things up with Porter Lee for a separate career. Jim can't process this at all and tries to talk them around. "You'll disappear without me. We disappeared with you. Piss off." Reeling from this bombshell, Jim resolves to press ahead as a solo artist and agrees on a 50-50 split with Mike, much to Danielle's disgust. He sets about fleshing out the idea that's been fermenting with him since the day of his mother's funeral, and which has taken him back to his days as an altar boy. It's going to be a glaring departure from the no-frills rock and roll that the Stray Cats are known for. A vague idea came to him that he might be able to turn a song of praise to Hosanna in the Highest into a hymn of love for woman. As overblown as that promises to be, Jim throws himself into the project, while between themselves, Mike and Porter Lee organise unprecedented media coverage for the grand unveiling of this project. The recording takes place over 4 months in New York. Just as they're about to wrap, a celebration party is laid on. Danielle heads back home to collect the cake that she's going to surprise Jim with, but Mike sneakily neglects to pass on her message to him, manipulating the evening's events so that a sulking Jim takes solace in the attention of a groupie, only for the unexpected Danielle to turn up to the event and to catch them at it. Much to Mike's satisfaction, this spells the end for Jim and Danielle's relationship. The broadcast performance of Dea Sancta is set up for the Albert Hall, and while life has no meaning for Jim without Danielle there, he presses ahead. An audience of millions is waiting to tune into it, and accolades such as poet of his generation being lavished upon him. But once this is over, he clearly aims to jump off the treadmill and to disappear. The performance and simultaneous broadcast go ahead successfully. There's not a lot of description to it in the book, but the segment of the film is fairly jaw-dropping stuff. I guess we've entered the age of the rock opera here, but I've never been sure whether we're meant to take this as Jim's artistic peak or if this is a comment on the kind of bombastic artistic bloat that certain artists who come up through the basic rock and roll of the 60s would become prone to. It's pretty bloody preposterous, although to be fair, it predates Freddie and Montserrat's Barcelona by a good 12 years. It predates Klaus Nomi also. Critically and commercially, this is a resounding success for Jim, but on that note, he makes good on his threats and he elopes to Spain, and Mike in tow, leaving an adoring worldwide audience on tenterhooks, in order to pursue the life of a mysterious artistic recluse. Locating a suitable abandoned castle in Granada, they call in some workmen to get the place in livable order and hole themselves up there for an undetermined length of time. Mike, who's never been particularly sold on rock and roll high life or groupies, seems fairly content with life, pottering around the place, coordinating the repair works and adopting a local stray dog in the process. Jim, on the other hand, wallows deep in self-pity and drug-induced apathy, alleviating the tedium with occasional visits from hookers which Mike arranges, engaging in an ill-advised boxing match with Mike one evening in which Jim is roundly clobbered. He takes his revenge by performing a cruel joke on Mike's dog, who's now carrying pups. He slips a tab of acid into the dog's bowl, a vicious stunt which traumatises the animal and causes her to miscarry. Jim is all contrition the next morning. "It was just a little tab of acid. It's never done anything like that to me," and advises Mike, "That makes us even then. Danielle, you know." Meanwhile, Porter Lee is not having much success with the Jimless Stray Cats and is itching to squeeze a bit more money out of his boy. Mike warns him that Jim is not in a good state to deliver. He hasn't played a single note in the 18 months that we've lived here. Porter Lee brushes this off as an artistic fallow patch and persists in setting up an exclusive live-to-air TV interview in order to satisfy a public curiosity that might, if he doesn't strike soon, go off the boil. Jim plays hard to get over the whole thing, but Mike reassures Porter Lee there's no way that he won't do it. He's like a girl, he just needs talking into things a bit. However, come the day of transmission, Jim's a wreck. He's not been sleeping. No amount of Mandrax or Nembutal seem to have rectified this. Mike hires him a hooker the night before as a treat, but it's the easiest night taking she's ever made. The next morning, helicopters, reporters, cameramen, Porter Lee and, most surprisingly, Danielle all descend. Jim's in a proper blue funk, but Mike's used to working miracles on him. Just as the film crews are about to panic, a curiously serene Jim, looking like a tranquilised Dudley Moore, he appears, exchanges pleasantries and settles down for his interview. A suitably dramatic intro spiel announces him before the reporter turns to the youth messiah and goes for the big question: just how much does God mean to Jim McClane? Somewhere between $2 or $3 million after tax. Jim slurs, looking worryingly over-relaxed. It degenerates rapidly from here. Jim has clearly wildly overdone it with the pharmaceutical Dutch courage, and as his coherence dissipates further, they cut to some old footage and call for medical attention. As the ambulance bumps along the primitive roads to the nearest casualty ward, Mike berates his near-comatose meal ticket. You selfish bastard, I made you. You're not going to fucking well die. I own half of you. But we're beyond the stage for such considerations now. Is he? Porter Lee asks at the hospital. Dead? Retorts Mike bitterly. He's been dead for years. We all are now. This is a paradoxically bleak vehicle for a 70s pop idol such as David Essex. Connolly's story could be taken as a distant cousin to 1975's Slade in Flame. It's a spectacularly downbeat take on the more troubled underside of musical success, a theme that loosely continues in our other title, Fred and Judy Vermorel's extensively researched study on the secret lives of pop fans, Starlust, which was published a decade later. Cumulatively, this volume, which was put together in the immediate years following John Lennon's murder. The effect is a bit like reading the letters page of a 1979 porno mag, or somewhere between that, and it covers similar territory to the later TV documentary I'm Your Biggest Fan, which was directed by Jane Harmston Green and broadcast in 1996 to the vicarious horror of many of us. Much like that documentary, Starlust follows the obsessive strands of fandom far beyond the confines of enthusiasm, and at its extremes into the realm of full-blown mental illness. Now, I'm conscious for the need for some sort of responsible perspective on that, and the need to resist the temptation to make voyeuristic capital of it. But the book's opening line, attributed to Joanne: "When I make love with my husband, I imagine it's Barry Manilow. All the time." You see what we're up against. Joanne pitches us deep into the quagmire of Manilust, a collective frenzy of frustrated passions amongst his largely middle-aged audience of admirers who've taken their obsession to the kind of extremes which in some cases seems to threaten their real-world marriages. Manilust, very much a phenomenon of its time, makes up a disproportionate section of this book. Manilow, a couple of years ago, came out of the closet, but there's no hint of the possibility of that within the pages here. Troubling as the Mani lovers are, the Bowie fixated take things a few degrees further. There's an extensive cross-section of Bowie fantasies and fan mail here, and they tend to be mystical, magical, and largely at the more disturbing end of the spectrum. Carolyn gets it into her head that she's seeing the album covers before they come out, and her fantasies veer towards Bowie becoming injured in some way. I've thought of killing him. It's a sort of frustration or anger. Why don't you pay attention to me? Marnie, meanwhile, lies in bed thinking of him, and suddenly there's a tingly thing inside her, and then a big squirting noise. Julie's hallucinatory hysteria towards Bowie has burned itself out into a state of resigned cynicism. He achieved it by sheer tactics. Try this, let's see how the kids react, and then completely washing his hands of the whole business, not actually accepting the responsibility for what he's done by becoming a besooted man with a blonde hairdo and a lot of money. What an astute criticism of 80s Bowie. I don't think I've ever read better. A more current crop of 80s pop stars are also, of course, represented. It's easy to forget that Sting was once teenage heartthrob material. Chloe's police fantasy has her playing Stuart Copeland off against Sting, probably as Sting gets all the attention. So she's playing about with Copeland while Sting watches from the doorway. Sue, meanwhile, indulges in a sub-dom type of fantasy with Adamant. in which Prince Charming has her at the end of a bullwhip and instructs her, "Get on all fours, punky." So, Manilow, Bowie, Sting, Adam. Where do we go from here? Nick Haywood. Aye. He's in for a surprising amount of action here. Evidently the subject of a whole level of obsession, riding Susie in her dreams like a stallion. I told you about the 1979 porno talk. While she's not obsessing in extraordinary detail about what furnishings his flat might have, Flotex 21 carpets apparently. Along with these tales of fantasy and obsession, the grimy world of real-life experiences are also part of the mix here. An unnamed groupie details a fleeting romance with X, an unspecified name guitarist within the new romantic scene, who plays her along for a bit after an encounter at the Camden Palace, but evidently doesn't really give a fuck. And two groupies, Lynn and Kelly, relate their experiences as camp followers of all people, Classics Nouveau, who, to be fair, don't sound like a terrible bunch if you ignore a short stay session muso that they'd hired, but it does all sound a bit demeaning towards the girls. So what is the continuity between Starlust and Stardust, other than the title? Well, David Essex does make an appearance here, although the story is a bit of a dead end. Nancy is obsessed over him, but the only chance she gets to come close, the end of a gig, she's shunted out of the way by a bouncer, and as David bowls past in his Land Rover, he doesn't even bother to wave at the crush of girls waiting there. Apart from very obviously titillating elements to all this, there are guys breaking into Fred and Judy's answer phone while they talk about Debbie Harry. There's the underlying taste of unhealthy obsession, acute loneliness, and the psychosis that creeps in when love turns to hate. As Pete Townsend points out in his introduction here, the fantasies of maniacs are really just the wonderful dreams of people like you and me, searching for a worldly placebo in our search for the divine. He acknowledges, again, the shadow of Lennon's death looms large, that sometimes this can go badly wrong, but he applauds the creativity of such dreams. To me, the most memorable, and perhaps the least complicated and the most straightforward, is Stephen's fantasy about jam bass player Bruce Foxton. In Stephen's dream, he wanders into his school labs, and there's Bruce engaging in an act of self-pollution. Stephen sidles up to him at the urinal and leans over. What an ace dick he has! It is 7 inches long and has a big red knob, and I can see brown hairs peeping through. Stephen's not obsessing about Bruce's furniture. There's no agonising about why Bruce isn't replying to his letters. Stephen knows what he wants and he's not coy about it. So both volumes, although coming from very different angles, are in turn funny, sad, tragic and even morbid. But they both in their way treat the subject area of rock stardom and its grimy back alleys with a certain amount of respect or a level of affection. Ultimately, as Pete Townsend's foreword to Starlust suggests, this is an intrinsic part of what rock and roll is about. Both books are very hard to tear yourself away from.
Here, Thunderprice, come here. Come here. You two fancy a groin?